On the disclosure point, I think it's important to note that the issue was not addressed in WRTL because in that case, WRTL said, look, we shouldn't be subject to the funding restriction, but we're happy to disclose where the money came from. So there was no challenge to the disclosure provision. And in McConnell, prior to WRTL, the court, by a vote of 8-1, had upheld the disclosure provision of McCain-Feingold on a facial basis. And you had Justices Kennedy and Scalia, who voted to strike down the funding provision, nonetheless say the disclosure provision was constitutional. Only Justice Thomas dissented on that point in McConnell. So for the disclosure provision to be struck down here, you would have to have at least those two justices, I think, change their mind, which would be surprising, I guess. And I think it would be, again, surprising to find a disclosure provision struck down. Disclosure provisions have almost always been upheld by the court over the last 30 years in this context. And it would be pretty striking to have the disclosure provision struck down, even on an as-applied basis. On the funding restriction, you know, in the first instance, I think there's plenty of opportunity to uphold it, even for the Roberts Court to uphold it, on the ground that in WRTL they said the funding restriction can apply to the functional equivalent of express advocacy. The documentary it constitutes such, and it can constitutionally be applied to this kind of documentary. But if it's struck down, I think what will be critical is the grounds for doing so. They could say it doesn't apply to this ad on very narrow grounds, such as the context of on-demand video, or they could approach that question on the broad grounds Rick mentioned, of saying that the corporate funding prohibition is unconstitutional entirely and overrule Austin. Let me just quickly mention the other two cases because they're a little further down the line. There's a case brought by the Republican Party against the Federal Election Commission, which is sort of a parallel case to WRTL and seeks to do to the soft money ban provisions what WRTL did to the electioneering communication provision, and basically say that the soft money ban, although constitutional on its face as upheld in McConnell, is nonetheless unconstitutional as applied to certain activities that the RNC wants to engage in. And what the RNC is saying is, look, we want to raise and spend soft money for certain activities which are not going to affect federal elections. There are certain non-federal activities like litigation or like grassroots lobbying or like spending on state and local elections. And because those activities do not affect federal elections at all, they can't be subject to the ban on soft money. The party is seeking to be able to, you know, kind of roll the clock back prior to McCain-Feingold, open up soft money accounts, raise non-federal funds, soft money, and spend it for these non-federal activities. What's going to be interesting there in the court's approach is whether it adheres to the analysis the court used in McConnell to say the issue with the soft money ban is not what the money is spent for, but how the money is raised, and the problem of corruption and the appearance of corruption that is inherent in the act of a national party raising and spending these very large non-regulated funds. That case, still in district court, probably will be decided next fall, and there's a direct appeal to the Supreme Court after that, so that could well be on the court's docket by next winter. Last case is a case also in district court brought by a group called Speech Now, which explores a kind of seam in the Buckley decision. Buckley said you can impose limits on contributions, you can't impose limits on expenditures. This case poses the question of, can you impose limits on contributions raised by a group only for the purpose of making independent expenditures? Speech Now is a 527 group that really qualifies to be a political committee, and as such would be subject to a $5,000 contribution limit. It's saying it wants to use its money only to make independent expenditures, and the contribution limit, therefore, can't constitutionally be applied to a group which wants to spend money for that purpose. That, again, poses very important questions that really have not been resolved by the courts since that limit was enacted in 1974. It's on a kind of unusual procedural track. There's a district court here in Washington that's going to certify a factual record probably sometime over the summer to the D.C. Circuit. The case will be argued and heard by the D.C. Circuit sitting en banc, the whole court together, which is very unusual, probably sometime next winter. And after that, there would be the opportunity for an appeal. And because the case is central and important and presents an unresolved issue, I think there's a very good chance that that issue could be decided by the Supreme Court essentially 2 terms from now. Thank you.